Today I want to take a look at how to verify a username and password against Azure Active Directory with a REST API call. So in Azure Active Directory, we have, of course, usernames and passwords. We can log people in, and we have authentication capabilities in the cloud. But what if you're designing an application where you want an electronic signature? You want to type in a password and hit enter and have it verify that that password is current. There are things you can do on-prem using the Directory Services namespace to test a login, but in the cloud, things are a little bit different. In the cloud, we need to work with tokens, and there's more of an OAuth model, so doing a plain text password is generally not needed and not always wanted. There's some security reasons for staying with the token model. However, if we want to validate that a username and password are available and current and valid, there are some options we have. First thing we want to do is start a new Web API project. Here at spjeff.azurewebsites.net, I have an API generator. We can put in our name, verify Azure Active Directory, and download a classic zip. This is going to give us a starter project that already has the name pre-filled for the namespace and for the controller. Once inside of the project, we can double check under controllers that we have the proper namespace, verify Azure AD. So we can see our namespace is here. We can see the name of our solution, the name of our project, all either matching, and we have a standard controller that echoes back the current date and time. Now, for this all to work correctly, we will want to restore the NuGet packages over here by hitting the restore button. And that'll download all the dependencies. They're not part of the template because it makes the template too large and the versions are changing. So if we do a NuGet restore and a build, we can compile our API to make sure we have a base starting point. Here on output, we see that the build succeeded one time. And if we go ahead and F5, we can invoke the hello controller to see the current date and time. So here we have a home page for the API project, kind of a readme.aspx. And then when we invoke the API, we get to see the current date and time. Excellent. Now we'd like to add some more functionality to this with a new controller that goes above and beyond doing some new things. We'll select the Web API 2 controller empty and give it a name of auth controller. So here in our new controller, we want to decorate things a little bit differently. We're going to use a helper method to authenticate to Azure Active Directory. For the controller itself, in the body, we can go ahead and copy what our hello controller has as far as a layout and what should really be inside of this namespace for the auth controller. So here we'll change name to auth controller. And we'll go ahead and remove this for the moment. Yep, and that looks good. Enumeral hello get. So the get method here is going to be a public async string. And that is for the standard get. So we'll change it from IEnumeral string to an async string. And for task, we do need to resolve this using System.threading task. And that's for async await pattern, which is something that we'll need. And in here, we do need to change the body to something that will use an async method. We also are going to want to support parameters. So in our class for the controller, we are going to add one more class for configuration parameters. So this essentially are parameters that people can send in via an HTTP post. Yep, okay, good. And we're going to want to bring in a method which supports a lot of the login functionalities. So if we come over here and we check the public void post, this kind of has a little bit more flexibility. The parameters are not a string value. It's going to be auth params, and we will name it auth param singular. Now the body for this method is going to parse them and use them to call an external namespace, which does our authentication. So here we have acquire token by username and password. That's going to be our core method, which allows us to know if a username password is valid. It's part of the identity client DLO. So for identity client, we do have a name of a NuGet packages here. So for that, we will need to go over to Studio and open our package manager and say install package and provide the identity client package there. Yep. Using identity client, that's good. That's good. Secure string, we want to do using System.Security. We're kind of resolving some of the dependencies by adding more NuGet packages and building things out a little more complete to get some of the red squigglies resolved. Yeah, and here for this method, this was actually meant to be for post, not for put. Different. And for post, we do want it to be async task string, not a void. Okay, that looks much better. So this is a generic that takes in parameters. It wants to try read permissions against Azure Active Directory, needs to know the name of your tenant, it needs a client ID, and then a username password. And it invokes this method here, acquire a token by username password. This is really the core of the whole project, is invoking that via HTTP. So we have all these methods. We'll do a build. Not all code paths return a value for get. And that makes sense because what we're going to do there is the same thing as the more generic post with its parameters. But up here, we're going to hard code in some values for today's demo and testing. So for this, we will need to go register a client ID on the tenant in Azure Active Directory and bring it back over. So in Azure Active Directory, we can go to Enterprise Applications and we can register our new API. We'll click New Application. We'll do this one right here, application that you're developing. And the name here can be the same as our project. We'll call it Verify Azure AD. Accounts in this directory only. That'll work for registration. And down here on the properties, we will find the client ID for our new registration. That needs to go into our project. So the client ID matches up to what we just created. Now for authentication, we will want to change the default client type to a yes and go ahead and save that change. There's a lot of different things here with client secrets, with uploading of certificates, API permissions. We will grant for the whole domain here so that it can read the Azure Active Directory domain. And those are the two essentials, the API permission here, and then also the default equals yes. Okay, so now that we have our application registered in the enterprise applications, we can come to Visual Studio and do a build succeeded, hit F5 to run our project, and go test our authentication endpoint by invoking an HTTP GET. So we'll first do the hello endpoint that it echoes time, kind of lets us know that things are up and running. We'll do auth, and it says the request must contain the following parameter, password. Right, so we're not providing one. So here we could go ahead and stop this, put in the word test, build succeeded, F5 to run the project. And again, now we'll go ahead and get our controller started again. We'll do hello, and we'll invoke the auth endpoint. Invalid username or password. My password's not actually test, but it did make a connection, and this is really important. This is a good error message because it's showing us that it's able to try talking to Azure Active Directory. It's just that the password is not actually correct. So we'll go ahead and stop the project and go get something else for a password. Okay, so in the background, I went ahead and input the correct value. We'll hit F5 to run the project. And so all I did was change the string for password. We'll go ahead and do our hello endpoint. And now we can run our auth endpoint. And lo and behold, we have a token. That is a legitimate Azure AD authentication token. It tells us that the user credentials were correct, that we sent a good password and a good username for this particular tenant. And you do have to register a client ID to make this all work, but super exciting stuff, and it's really cool to see it working. So I went ahead and set the password back to test so we can take a quick look at the code again. So we are using, HTTP cores. We're using System.threading task and security. The security is for a secure string of the password characters, which is a required format for the API. The Microsoft Identity Client namespace is where this acquire token by username and password lives. That's our kind of finished API call. These are all testing parameters for an HTTP GET, but then we support an HTTP POST where you could pass in the parameters as JSON. So this lets you send a JSON block with these named properties and invoke the API any way that you'd like. So the client ID we fetch out of Azure Active Directory by making a new enterprise application. It's over here as client ID. There are two settings we need to enable. One is the default client type is yes. And the second is an API permission for consent on the whole organization, which provides read permission. So you register the app, turn on those two settings. Go make your web API project with this block of code that does the acquire token. And now you have an API that lets you verify a username and password. So if you have credentials and you're not sure if they're any good, you can send them to this API and it'll give you the yes or no. Thanks for watching.